Now, we'll come on to Bugle Call to Freedom in just a moment, but first I'd just like to give you a little bit of an update on the Monte San Martino Trust itself. Of course, as we all know, this is a rather sad and strange year, and we send our sympathies to all those members and friends in this country and in Italy who've been affected by the virus. As a trust, we've tried to keep the wheels turning, but we've had to cancel our popular lunch in November, and we were sadly unable to welcome any bursary students from Italy this year. Although those who applied have been promised the opportunity to come in 2021, if at all possible. Let's just keep our fingers crossed. Now, meanwhile, the work goes on. Our volunteers have continued building the Monte San Martino online archive of escape accounts, which is becoming ever more popular with those researching this extraordinary period. The archive is accessible via the Monte San Martino Trust website. Do have a look if you haven't already done so. And we're still in discussion with Cambridge University Library, where we hope that the original archive accounts will be housed. Now, as part of our aim to help keep the story alive in Italy, we are now in the final stages of negotiating a grant to Istituto Pari, which coordinates more than 50 historical institutes throughout Italy. And this grant will help them build a website with comprehensive information about the wartime prison camps and escapes. And we're very much looking forward to that collaboration. We're also working with the Escape Lines Memorial Society to build a permanent memorial in the UK to all the brave Italian people who helped escapers in Italy. The memorial will be at the fascinating and extremely moving Eden Camp World War II Experience Museum in York, and it's well worth a visit if you're up that way. I'm delighted to say that fundraising continues too. We should see on our screens in a moment a picture of Graham Jones, captain of Sudbury Golf Club, whose father, Corporal Albert Jones, was a POW at Sforza Costa camp. He made Monte San Martino his captain's charity at the golf club in the year 2020. And it's an absolutely amazing story. He decided with his vice captain to do 4 rounds of golf in aid of the charity. That's a punishing 72 holes in a single day. And he raised £4,350 and counting. They started at 5 in the morning, finished at 7 o'clock in the evening, and Graham used a specially commissioned titliced 72 ball. He claims that he didn't lose it throughout the 4 rounds, which is in itself quite an achievement, certainly by my standards. Graham, thank you so much, and we're absolutely delighted to have you here on the Zoom. Now then, Namina, I think I'm right in saying that you can show us all the participants on screen. How many are there altogether?
We are 92 right now.
92 people on the screen. I really am so grateful. It's great of you all to join us. I'm sorry we can't be together in person to celebrate the launch of this great book, but it's wonderful that we've all taken the trouble to be here on the Zoom. We're waiting for Marco Minardi to join. And Marco was the Italian historian who wrote the original book, L'Orizzonte del Campo, or The Camp's Horizon. He wrote the book in 1995, in Italian, obviously, sponsored by the local comune. And I hope we have the Sindaco, the mayor of Fontanellato, on the line this evening, Francesco Trivelloni, a great friend of the Trust, and indeed one of our original students, bursary students. So I'm hoping I'm going to be talking to Marco during the course of this evening. But I have definitely got online John Simpkins, our trust administrator, and he is the man who has translated this book into English. We also have Christopher Woodhead, the second of our new trustees. That's John there. We've also got Christopher Woodhead, there he is, the second of our new trustees, who has produced and printed the book so beautifully. And finally, we're going to be joined by the third of our new trustees, that's Namina, Christopher, and now Julia Mackenzie, who has done much of the extra research for the book. So we've got pretty much a full house, although I don't think we've got Marco still just yet. So I think I'm going to start, John, with you in just a moment. I'm guessing that pretty much everybody on the call knows, at least in outline, the extraordinary story of how some 30,000 Allied servicemen, out of an estimated 80,000 total, escaped from around 80 prisoner of war camps in Italy after the Italian armistice in September 1943, and how they were helped while they were on the run by as many as 60,000 Italian individuals or families. Fontanellato, or PG Campo 49, a few miles from Parma in northern Italy, was one of those 80 camps. Its inmates were about 500 Allied officers, mostly British, and 100 or so other ranks who acted as orderlies and assistants. Fontanellato was a model camp, housed in an imposing and newly constructed orphanage right next to the main church in the town, and designed to show to Red Cross inspectors how very well the Italians looked after their prisoners of war. I think we can take it that Fontanellato was well above the standard of all of the other camps. Thanks to the excellent relationship that the senior British officer in the camp, Colonel Hugo de Burr, had established with the Italian camp commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Eugenio Vicedomini, uniquely, all 600 of the men in the camp marched out in formation through the wire soon after the armistice had been announced. And the signal for the escape was 3 Gs, blown on a bugle to herald the imminent arrival of German troops, and of course, hence the title of the book that Marco originally wrote and that John has translated. John, let me turn to you first. It's a lovely translation. I think we would all want to congratulate you just on the pure translation itself. It's beautifully written in English. It must have taken many hours of hard work. Did you stick closely to the original, or have you added and revised? It looks a bit longer perhaps than the original. I think you've added some images. Did you have some help? Just tell us how you went about the whole task of translating L'Orizzonte del Campo.
Well, thank you, Nick. In fact, the idea was Christopher Woodhead, and you're going to hear from him shortly. And he suggested this to me after one of our Martino lunches a couple of years ago. And we both knew that Marco's book would have some very interesting things to say from an Italian perspective, because, of course, a lot of the prisoners of war at Fontanellato had written about it, but not from the Italian side of things. And we knew also that a large party of our supporters had been out to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the escape in 2018. And Marco then took us on a walk in the footsteps of the prisoners. So we knew that this was a book that we wanted to have in English. So that's how it began. And we assembled a very good team of volunteers. As Nick said, we have Julia Mackenzie, who did terrific work checking the sources in the National Archives and elsewhere. Rosella Ruggiero, who made sure that I wasn't making too many mistakes in translating the Italian. She checked that certainly twice. And then Roger Browning, who did the editing of the text in English. So that was the how it came about. In answer, Nick, to your question, is it different from Marco's Italian edition? In a couple of respects, yes. We have included more maps, and we have included more and different images, and we're very, very pleased that two families in particular, descendants of prisoners at Fontanellato, made some invaluable images accessible. We have paintings reproduced in the book that were made during his imprisonment at Fontanellato by Lieutenant Mike Goldingham, known as Mike the Forger, because Mike Goldingham, wherever he was, whichever camp he was at, with his artistic skills, he was able to produce a lot of forged passes, Gestapo passes, and the rest of it. And in fact, a cache of these at Fontanellato was discovered very shortly before the armistice was signed and before the prisoners escaped on the 9th of September 1943. So we are very grateful indeed to the Goldingham family for letting us use these. And we're also very grateful to the family of Eric Newby. And of course, Eric Newby is well known to a lot of us as the famous travel writer and author of Love and War in the Apennines. And he was indeed a prisoner at Fontanellato. And of course, during his escape, he met his wonderful wife, Wanda. So thank you to the Newby family. And I know that Sonia Ashmore, Eric's daughter, is with us tonight, as is indeed is Patrick Goldingham. The last thing we did, Nick, in terms of difference was I made more prominent the story of the Cervi family who lived near Parma, because one of the great tragedies of the Italian resistance was the killing of 7 sons of the Cervi family for their resistance, for their anti-fascist resistance, and indeed for hiding prisoners. This story is extremely well known in North Italy, but it's not well known to British readers, and so we gave that more prominence.
John, I remember the walk you talked about when Marco led us literally in the footsteps of both our fathers, in fact. How did it feel for you as the son of a Fontanellato escapee yourself to get so close to this story and your own father's experience? Did you recognize Marco's descriptions from what you know of your own father's story? Did he talk about it much? I mean, just how did it feel? What was it like for you?
Well, yes, it was quite strange, because the more I dug into the story, the more interested I was in reading Dad's account. Dad was quite a reticent man. A lot of the prisoners, of course, weren't quick to write up their memoirs, but my mum persuaded him to write up his account of what he could remember anyway, in the 1980s. And one thing that struck me, Nick, was that, of course, the prisoners were only 6 months at Fontanellato. And we're talking here about 1943, with 3 or 4 years of war already completed. And my father had already been in 2 prisoner of war camps in Italy, at Sulmona, east of Rome, in the Abruzzi, and at Montalbo, near Piacenza, in the north. And then he was going to have 2 more camps in the Czech Protectorate and in Germany, following his recapture after 2 months on the run in Italy after leaving Fontanellato. So it's interesting looking at, because I've read a passage that I'd like to read, very, very short sentence really, from his account of his time at his first camp, where he was a whole year, and he entered very, very fully into the life of that camp, lecturing on law and following other lessons, and he became president of the mess committee. And he says that he justified that. I mean, in a sense, he didn't need to, but he justified it by saying the background should not be forgotten. it was the prospect of a very long period of captivity, making great demands on mental and moral stamina, and requiring a determined and deliberate effort to build barriers against frustration, despair, and eventual collapse. And I'm sure, I mean, that's very illuminating for me, because I'm sure that this was really what the prisoners were having to contend with. When it came to his memories of Fontanellato, and I should say that my father, although he didn't attempt to escape from any Italian camps before Fontanellato, when he was in Germany, he was the security officer on the escape committee. Fontanellato, he remembers Vice Domini as a gentleman. He remembers columns of very impressive German troops marching past the camp singing Lili Marlene, and he remembers preparing his pack for the escape, and particularly laying hold of some fine black boots that my mother had sent him.
That's great. I'm interested as well, because I think that you have been able to meet up with the local family in the area of Fontanellato who helped your father, you know, immediately after the armistice. Is that right? I mean, that must have been a great experience.
Yes, well, I haven't actually met them, but thanks to one of our friends in Fontanellato, Pietro Bettati, I was able to correspond, and I'm still corresponding, with the descendants of two families. One was really about the first family that Dad stayed with, and it was a family called Borioni, and he says that in his memoir that they were made extremely welcome. They fed us generously, gave us beds, and fitted us out in civilian clothes so that we could move about less conspicuously. All our hosts wanted in return, and this was to prove universally true, was to find out as much as they could about us and our families, and to talk about their own relations in the services or abroad as emigrants. Photographs of wives and children were valuable currency, and he was to find that all the way through. The person I corresponded with most is a gentleman called Diego Leonardi, who is the grandson of the family who, a day or two after this, then hosted and hid my father and his fellow brother officer, they were just a pair of them at that point. And what Diego has been able to do is to obtain a copy of a note that my father left with the family in September 1943 in his own inimitable handwriting, which I always found impossible to decipher as a boy. And he was doing this at the age of 31. He wrote this note thanking the Leonardi family for their bravery in looking after him. And when I and Diego Leonardi saw that note about a year or 18 months ago, it was a wonderful feeling, and a wonderful feeling for me, my brother, my sister, and all the Leonardo family.
Thank you, John, for that memory.
I'm here.
Ah, excellent. Marco, let's have Marco up on the screen there. Hello, Marco.
Sorry for the problem, but I wasn't accepted.
We're delighted to have you with us, Marco. Now, this is Marco Minardi, who wrote the original book, L'Orizzonte del Campo. And if I may, Marco, you know, first of all, I just want to say thank you so much for generously allowing the Trust to publish the English version of your book. Tell us, you know, what prompted you to write L'Orizzonte del Campo in the first place, and what kind of reception did the book have in Italy at the time? And, you know, is the story still remembered in Italy today?
Well, let me say firstly that I would like to thank the San Martino Trust and John for having translated my book in English. it's an honor. And I must say I was rather excited when John called me up the first time. And the book is very nice, and some of the inaccuracies were put right, and there are new photos, and it's really a very good work. Well, I started because like a lot of my colleagues who study the Italian liberation movement and the resistance, we found out in the years that there was a piece missing in that story. There was not everything fixed, not everything fell in its right place. And that was the presence of the Allies inside that, that liberation struggle. The resistance documents don't often speak about them. And so a lot of us tried to find out where we could find documents and fill in that part of the story. We started, and I started with the SOE missions and the OSS missions, and we started to build up stories that contemplated the presence of the Allies and the resistance movement. And at the beginning of all this, there were the prisoners of war camps, which seemed to be another story, but they were not, because as we all know now, in a lot of the northern regions of Italy, those prisoners that were able to flee from the camp before the German army arrived, in some way opened the paths for the partisans and the first deserters of the new fascist army towards the mountains. It were the prisoners of war which found out, sometimes on their own lives, which were the houses, which were the valleys, which were the towns that were friendly, where the fascists weren't present, where the population and the farmers were willing to help those who were fighting the Germans and the neo-fascist army. So the story began of the resistance and liberation in Italy, central and northern Italy, started to become more credible. It became somewhat more true than what it was before. And so I started to try to fill in these missing pieces, obviously with the documents that are kept at the National Archives, Imperial War Museums, and now a lot of the diaries and that are published on the San Martino Trust site. And this helped also the local communities to build up their story. For all this time, the contadini and the small towns and the people from Fontanellato felt that what they had done and what was their story wasn't part of the resistance movement, wasn't part of that story. So in some way, the history and the stories of the prisoners of war escapees helped to give back to these communities their story.
And thank you. And that's one of the, I mean, I think the book is fantastically well researched, Marco. I mean, you must have put an enormous amount of work in. You obviously visited, you read the accounts of so many of the prisoners, you gathered stories from local people, and you clearly visited our National Archive. I mean, it's a most impressive piece of scholarship, if I may say so. One of the points, and it's interesting what you've just been saying, that you link very strongly the history about the prisoners' escape with the growing resistance in Italy leading up to and immediately after the armistice. And you talk about the local committees that came together to help and to coordinate this effort. And of course, we've just been hearing earlier on in the Zoom, I think before you joined us, about the Chervy family and many others who suffered grievously for the help they gave. Just tell us a little bit more about those committees and to what extent this was a real kind of local movement that came together both to resist eventual Nazi occupation, but that also came together to help the prisoners.
Well, I'm still working on the relationship between prisoners of war in the mountains and the partisan movement. It's rather complicated to figure out how much the resistance wanted prisoners of war to become guerrillas, and how often and how much the prisoners were willing to join the partisan movement. But to answer your question, I think that we can divide the answer in two pieces. The first is that when the prisoners were free in the countryside or in the mountains or in the cities or in the towns, the political committees, Comitati di Liberazione Nazionale, tried to get in contact straight away with them because they wanted find ways to communicate with the Allied troops in the south. They wanted to be recognized by the Allies as part of the struggle to liberate Italy. They needed the help from the Allies, and so they thought that trying to contact the prisoners of war, helping them, would be the right way. And anyway, they were on the same side. They were against the German occupation and the neo-fascists. But there is also another part of the Italians who helped the prisoners of war for simple reasons, not for political reasons, because they needed help, because the population, large part of the population, didn't want to have anything to do with the new war that was breaking out after the 24th of July of 43, when the fascist government fell, and before the 8th of September of 1943. They were hoping that the armistice, that the end of the war had come, and Italy would be out of the Second World War. With the arrival of the Germans, they didn't want to do anything, have nothing to do with it. So, helping these young men to survive, not to be captured once again, and to give them a chance to be free, they felt it was their duty of doing this. Some of them had paid with their lives. I remember what one of the farmers of Fontanellato told me. One of the sons of the farmer of San Fontanellato, a family who helped prisoners. He said when 3 young men knocked at the door, my father said, "Well, what can we do?" He had a brother who was a prisoner of war in England. He says, "I hope they do the same thing that we're going to. I hope they do the same thing as we are going to do. We need to help them. It's like if they were my brother." So they let them in, and they helped them, and they dressed them with civil clothes and try to help them. So there's two worlds that come together in that moment when in Italy the war carried on, but in a different way, and at the same time the population and the various political committees and the populations of the mountains, the farmers and the people in Italy didn't try to help the prisoners in showing that all that had happened in Italy for over 20 years was now past. It was history.
I often find myself wondering, Marco, whether if the positions had been reversed, whether English people would have been quite so welcoming to escaping Italian prisoners of war. in our own country? Well, that's a question perhaps for us all to ponder. But I mean, you've talked about what the local community did. I think it's true to say, isn't it, that Colonel Vicedomini and some of his other senior staff in the prison themselves felt a tremendously strong impulse, duty even, to help the prisoners. Do you think that Vicedomini, who you talk about at some length in the book, do you think he fully understood the risks he was taking and the likely consequences for him from what he was doing?
Yes, I think so. I think so. I believe it.
He was a very brave man.
Yes, he was a military. He was part of the Italian army. He wasn't a fascist, and he probably he was a monarchist. He was he believed that Italy had declared the armistice. So now Italy was out of the war. He had broken up the alliance with Germany, and his duty was to be a soldier and respect the other soldiers, as he had done during those months in Fontanellato. And so it was his duty to respect the orders and respect his beliefs. He was, as I said, he wasn't a fascist. There were many other commanders of prisoners of war camp like him. There were also prisoners, commanders of prisoners of camps who were fascists. So they did exactly the opposite. But he wasn't like most of the army of officers who believed that the war was over. And but this means that he was a person who wasn't going to betray his beliefs, and he wasn't going to betray the British prisoners, his prisoners, because the king and the Badoglio government had signed the armistice with the Allies.
Well, I mean, of course, it's quite extraordinary what he did. He posted sentries to keep a lookout for approaching Germans. He gave the command that 3 Gs should be blown on the bugle to sound the alarm if the Germans did appear. He gave orders for the cutting of the wire that enabled all 600 of the prisoners to march out in formation, watched by Ronnie Noble with a camera, who took copious photographs of all the prisoners marching. Unfortunately, nobody's ever found the film. It would be worth a king's ransom if we could ever find that film and the pictures of the prisoners marching out. And he said that he would defend the camp against the Germans with the other guards if he had to. And of course, then, as we know, he was very badly beaten up by the Germans. He was in danger of being executed on the spot, and ended up sadly and tragically in Mauthausen concentration camp, which he survived, but he actually died quite soon after he returned to Italy. And talking about Vicedomini, Christopher, I want to bring you in, because you, as the producer of the book and as a new trustee of the Monte San Martino Trust, you have a particular family connection to this story, and indeed to Vicedomini himself. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's right, Nick. Thank you very much. Yes, my grandfather, because he had actually fought through both world wars and was, I think, rather older than most of the other inmates in the camp, probably at least twice their age. He was nearly 50. He was the senior British officer in the camp, and it was his connection and relationship with Vicedomini that helped to organize and facilitate the escape. He had been captured in North Africa, along with many others, back in 1942, and had been through a number of camps in Italy before ending up at Fontanellato, where I suspect by dint of age he became senior British officer. There were a number of other high-ranking people there as well, but he seemed to assume that role. He then after the escape, made it into Italy by climbing over some of the highest mountains in the Alps, which was a truly remarkable story. But I never knew him. He died before I was born. But I remember my mother and subsequently rereading the account of his escape across the mountains, and being in awe of his bravery through following the escape.
I think many of the accounts pay tribute to his cool head, the relationship he formed with Vici Domini, an extremely open and cooperative one, and his very sort of sensible approach to the actual march out and to the hiding of the prison, this extraordinary interlude where the prisoners, having marched out of the camp, a few hours ahead of the Germans, then hid out in the sort of a local dried up stream, 600 of them, all crouching down in this little stream, trying to decide what to do. And I think, again, certainly my own dad paid tribute to the way Colonel de Burgh just led the men through this extremely testing experience and then facilitated them to move on, where, of course, as we know, many other English prison camp commanders decided to obey the famous stay put order that had come from London and actually denied their men the chance to get out. So I think, John, you and I owe Christopher's grandfather, who sadly he never met, a great debt of gratitude, don't we, for that, keeping a cool head in a really tough situation. Christopher, I'm intrigued. What does it actually mean to produce a book like this?
Well, on the emotional side, of course, it's very important because I think that it covers not only the English side of the story or British side of the story, Allied side of the story, but also the very bravery, which is the real story about this escape of the Italians, and the very deep connections that we've have with Italy, so that's on the emotional side, and the very intense sort of family involvement. On the practical side, there's a number of things one has to do. And firstly, I'd like to thank again Marco for allowing us permission to produce the book, translate it, and tweak the odd bit here and there. That was the first step. And then, of course, John's translation is impeccably done, and as indeed is the round and round of copy editing and proofreading that we did through Roger and Julia. So that's the sort of the early part of it. Then we had to produce a cover, and we had a bit of a battle there. Julia, I'm pleased to say, won the battle and produced. Can we put the covers up on screen, Namina? Is that possible, just to show the cover of Bugle Call to Freedom, possibly with L'Orizzonte as well, if you've got the picture there. Oh, here we are. That's the original version on the left, L'Orizzonte del Campo, Marco's original version, sponsored by the Comune, the mayor of Fontanellato. And then on the right, there's Bugle Call to Freedom, the English version, Marco with your name on it, and the 3 Gs coming out of the trumpet. That's lovely. Thank you very much, Namina. Back to you, Christopher. Then we had several rounds of typesetting to get the book into shape, and then, of course, we had to decide where to print it and how to distribute it. Now, and I can see that Nick has a lot of books behind him, but I don't think he has a garage ready to do pick, pack, and dispatch. So no. we chose a printer, an on-demand printer, to produce the book and stockhold it, and indeed distribute it throughout the globe should anybody be ordering it from anywhere on the planet. So that all sounds fairly simple, but it is, but not easy, I think, is the how I'd like to call it. Well, we're very grateful to you, Christopher, for taking it on, actually, and a very generous contribution to the funds of the Trust. All proceeds from this book, thanks to Christopher and John and Marco, all proceeds from the sale of Bugle Call to Freedom are going straight to the Trust, which is a fantastic, fantastic contribution. Thank you so much. I'd like to bring in the other member of the team just quickly now, Julia Mackenzie.
You too have played your part in this extraordinary production. I think I'm right in saying that you've checked every single fact and all the many quotations from the other accounts. I mean, you know, what was your approach? What were you seeking to do here? Because of course, as we know, Marco himself did a wonderful job of the original research.
Well, because it was a translation, Marco had gone to the National Archives and the Imperial War Museum, and he had got original documents which he had translated into Italian. And of course, we were translating them back into English. And as anyone will know, a lot gets lost in translation. So we decided we had to go back to the original sources in order to get what the original people said or wrote. So that's why I went to the National Archives and I trawled through the, well, mostly prisoner of war escape reports that the prisoners did within days of crossing the line, if they were walking down to the south, or if they went over the mountains to Switzerland. And they gave an immediate report to the British Army there about what had happened to them, and they listed who had helped them, and they gave sort of details of their capture. And so we wanted to get back to these original documents. And of course, they really have a fantastic feel for the time. I mean, these are kind of British Army officers who are just speaking in a very kind of clipped way. And they just, you know, by going back to the original English, you get that sense of the time and the place when they're giving a very kind of factual report, but it just conveys something of the time and the people. So that's why we wanted to get that absolutely kind of real feeling for the original documents, and also the various books that Marco quotes from. So we went back to those. So to get a, you know, as I say, a real feel for the period and to make sure everything was absolutely accurate.
And was the Trust's own archive of escape accounts valuable?
That
maybe
was, of course.
Sources did you look at, you know, maybe sources that weren't available to Marco at the time?
Well, exactly. I mean, some of them, so Lieutenant Langrish, for example, Marco had consulted his account, which is in the Imperial War Museum, but we also have it in the archive. But there were other ones which, of course, have become available since he wrote his book, but they were very valuable, where there were places where there was some sort of ambiguity, or we weren't quite sure what exactly happened. So that's why we went back to the ones that are held in our own archive. And of course, it was at that point we discovered, as John mentioned, Goldingham's fantastic drawings of the events at the camp. You know, he has a drawing of the departure from the camp. He has a drawing of the hole where 5 prisoners escaped, you know, hid and then escaped. So those give a real verisimilitude to the book that is really fantastic and is a direct result of our archive. And again, I'd like to thank the Goldingham family for those, you know, giving us access to those.
Julia, you're now one of our trustees. What prompted your interest in this whole story?
Well, I have no family connection, you know, none at all. But I mean, like many of us, I'm of that generation that was born 10 to 15 years after the war. And it was very much part of my growing up. You know, my father was in the RAF, but he wasn't in Italy. And all, you know, his friends and my parents lived through the war. So, you know, all of us, I think, you know, we saw those movies on Saturday afternoon, you know, the Wooden Horse or the Colditz Story or the Dam Busters. So it was absolutely part of, you know, the kind of culture that I grew up in. And that, I'm a historian by training. So that's, I became very interested in the war. And, you know, I read Eric Newby's book, and that got me interested in the Italian story. And then I read John Verney's fantastic memoirs and Peter Mead's account. And these walks down Italy and the encounters with the Italians, and this great humanity in the midst of a war, where the encounters with the Italians, I mean, it just sort of really touched me. And then 3 years ago, I did my own long walk down Italy, 250 miles down the ridges of the Apennines, to try and get a sense of what those walks were like for those men. And that led me to read more about it. And I made a list of books, which is down the Trust website. And one of the things that we've added to Marco's book is a bibliography of 30 books and articles, all to do with Fontanellato by the prisoners or about those particular prisoners, so that our readers can sort of read more around the subject if they want to. So that's another thing we've added to the book.
Well, thank you, Julia. And thank you for your very warm and moving personal testimony there. Let me remind people, if you'd like to ask a question to our panel, please use the chat function at the bottom, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. But in the meantime, can I ask all four of our speakers, do we feel that the story of this extraordinary escape story is the story sufficiently told now? Is there more research to do? Is there more work that we should be doing to make sure that people, not just in the UK, but in Italy too, have a real understanding of what went on? I mean, Marco, let me start with you. What more do we need to do?
Well, I think that for the memory of this, of what we're talking about, in the single communities in Italy, I think it's important that there be more other research on the small camps and on what happened in single regions, because that gives that is very important for the memory of the locals of the war, for their memory and for their knowledge of what the war meant for their community, for their town, for their region. For the history, I think it's very important, and we are trying to do it in the Istituti Storici della Resistenza in Italy, to understand what was the how the prisoners walked through Italy. What was their relations with the guerrilla warfares? How did they interpret the resistance movement, and how the resistance movement helped them reach the front line or Switzerland, or how they tried to convince them to take part of the resistance movement, of the guerrilla warfare. It's very complicated, and most probably it depended on the single prisoners, the single British soldiers or officers, and it probably depended also on the guerrilla groups, if they were willing to have a British or South Africa or Commonwealth military in their squads, or if they preferred to fight their own battle alone and help them through reach freedom. So I think this is the very important, because it enriches the history of those important 20 months when the Second World War crossed all the Italian territory, and all the Italians realized what war meant. That war which Italy, together with Germany, had started, and the war that Italians had brought to Slovenia, Croatia, Greece, Northern Africa, Soviet Union, and where the war was fought in France. They experimented the war after 1943 on their own soil. So I think it's important to understand the relation between the partisan movement, the Comitati di Liberazione Nazionale, and the British officers or soldiers, simple soldiers.
Thank you very much, Marco. I've got a comment from Valerie Smith here. Presumably there are hundreds of such villages who will all have a story. Lots more work, Marco. So I think Valerie is urging you on to greater efforts with the hundreds of other villages who helped escapers. And Anne Copley, another of our trustees, says there are 1.5 million documents relating to these stories in the National Archive in Washington. All the records of the Allied Screening Commission in Italy were all taken to Washington, and that's where they repose. And one of the projects we have on in the trust at the moment is looking at whether we can somehow find a way to sponsor you know, some kind of index of those documents and the possibility of making them all available, both to British families or the families of escapers and indeed Italian families, whose stories largely those documents tell, the stories of the very brave Italians who helped. Angus has an interesting question here. Of the 600 escapees from Fontanellato, how many of their stories have we got on our archive, and how many routes have we managed to map?
Hello, Christine English.
Hello,
trustee.
Christine, one of our trustees. There she is. Hello, Christine.
Lovely meeting. On our online archive, we've got about 170, 180. But in addition to that, we've got a lot of published books as well that we're obviously not allowed to put up on into the internet. So that is still the physical archive that we're hoping that will move to Cambridge University. So in a way, despite the massive amount of work that's gone into this online archive, it's only a small drop in the ocean. 600 prisoners out of the 50, 60,000 who escaped into Italy is not very many, but nevertheless, it's an extremely valuable resource, and each of the individual stories is as fascinating and exciting as the next one.
Christine, I've got another question to you here from Karen, if I may. I'd like to know if there's a way or a system in place that would help us descendants to connect with each other, to figure out connections between our fathers and grandfathers. I'd love to know who my grandfather, for example, I'd love to know who knew my grandfather, for example, and who travelled with him on his escape journey. And I must imagine others must have a similar curiosity. I'm sure you've got a comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a bond between the relatives of those prisoners in Italy that's really very strong and quite difficult to explain, really. But I know personally, anyway, it's from the celebrations that we've had in Italy and elsewhere, it is a very valuable friendship that we have. So Karen's suggestion is a very good one, and we will do something specific about trying to set that up, Karen.
I mean, this is our whole objective, Karen, as a trust, is to try and somehow bring this story to the attention of a wider public, and in so doing to express our own personal gratitude, many of us, to the Italian people who helped our fathers, but also to make it easier for people like us coming after us who want to research this story, for it to be easier. I mean, I've done 30 years of research into my father's particular escape. And I've just written about that, and I know John has put a lot of work. So your point is very, very well made, and it's something we're trying to get to do a lot more about as a trust. Angela Lamport, whose uncle was also in Fontanellato camp, is asking, and this is, I think, one for you, Julia, as the bibliograph, if I may say. How long was it before the story about Fontanellato became kind of, known in the UK? What was the first published account of Fontanellato?
I would say probably Eric Newby's book, because you talk to anybody now who's not got some sort of personal connection with it, and they say, prisoners, Italy, they don't really know anything about it. And then you say Eric Newby, they go, oh yes, okay, yes, I know the story from Eric Newby's book. So I think, which came out in 1971. So I think that was probably the one that made the story known to a wider public. I mean, there were ones, as Christopher was talking about, his grandfather, and he wrote the story of his fantastic escape over the mountains to Switzerland, and that was in Blackwood's magazine in 1946. So, I think, although I think in that he just says from a camp in northern Italy, I'm not sure he actually mentions the name. So, I mean, the story started to come out, but as I say, the one that really made it wider known is, and still is to an extent, is Eric Newby.
Yes, I know Sonia, Eric and Wanda's daughter, is on the line. Sonia, Eric's book meant so much to so many of us. I mean, I had no idea where my father had been in prison camp, for example, until I read Eric's book and suddenly realized they must have been in the same camp. And it's a great book and a great read, anybody who hasn't yet seen. Love and War in the Apennines. And of course, one of the great love stories too, because Eric was helped to escape by Wanda, who was working as a nurse in the prison hospital when the escape actually took place, and eventually he made his way back to Italy after the war and married her. So isn't that a lovely story? I think we're just about time, are we not, to wrap up? And I see that Anne Hawtrey is asking how we can order a copy of the book. So I think I'm going to wrap up at this point. I will tell you how to order a copy of the book in just a moment, Anne. But first, I would like to ask Fabrizio Colaceci, sorry, I've mispronounced your surname, Colaceci, to say a few words on behalf of His Excellency, the Ambassador of Italy, and the Embassy as a whole, who give us wonderful support as an organisation, and for which we're really grateful. Fabrizio, what do you make of all this?
Well, first of all, I want to tell you that I'm really pleased to bring the greetings of Ambassador Trombetta, which is currently engaged in Italy with another event aimed at advancing our bilateral relations. You all know probably about the Pontignano Seminar, which is organized by the British Embassy in Rome annually, and is one of the great events that shape our horizon. Just to call back on one of the work of Professor Minardi's book. I wish to thank also the organizer and San Martino Trust for this, not only this lovely event, but also for their commitment and the engagement to promote a better understanding between our two people. This is something I can bring testimony in person. The beautiful book of Professor Minardi is all about bringing to light, if I may say, some so-called minor events that shaped our history in a very crucial time of one of the biggest pages of our recent past. Nothing less than the fall of the fascist regime, as you all know. But one thing is, what is minor? For as we all know, history is made by all events, big and small, which coexist like in a complex structure of interlinked Chinese boxes, to the point that it may become even very hard to distinguish between what is really big and what is small. I think the point that the title of the book made very clear is that the human quest of freedom, together with our ability to express compassion towards one another, regardless of whatever belongings or faith, are, as the stories told in this book clearly show, powerful engines able to turn small things into great ones. This is the way in which events of otherwise ordinary lives are projected onto the stage of history and take new and deeper shapes, thus casting some more light about the deep link between ethics, moral life, and politics. I want to stress this point. Historia magistra vitae, as you probably know. A link that so often risks being hidden, if not lost, within the intricacies of our ordinary politics in not less interesting times, however. I want to thank, on behalf of the ambassador, the author, Professor Minardi, for his deep and in-depth analysis of the Italian society and its way of being, for his almost neo-realistic, intimate images, for a very pleasant and beautifully written, and I would add also eminently translated book, with such a care for details, with my warmest, deepest wishes. Christmas is just a few, it can now find the success it deserves. If I may add a personal note, Mr. Chairman, and an answer to some of the questions that somebody raised during this lovely event. I am a grandchild of a man that fought in war for the fascism in Africa, was taken prisoner by the British and brought to work in a camp in this beautiful country many years ago, and who spent quite a lot of time here working hard, but also falling in love with the English woman, actually unfortunately the wife of the colonel that was his landlord. What he brought back to Italy as a fascist believer, he didn't die as a fascist believer, I can assure you, but he was a fascist believer. And there was also this part of the story that I felt it was useful to be said at your event. It told me about a story of a great country, a story of a great language. It brought back great appreciation, great consideration from this country. I would say even a love for this country and this language, and an excellent English. And the story that taught me when I was a child was very far from the perfida Albione, but was the memory of somebody that got in touch in the deepest way possible with the country and with its people. I think if wars erupt in history, it's not because diplomats fail, but because people do not understand each other so well. So, and this book is in a way a contribution to make each other understanding better. And is finally the task of your trust, which I highly appreciate. So thank you again, Nick, for the event, for the book, for the translation, from this memory that you bring and you add to the great horizon of the Italo-British friendship.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your really wonderful and very, very moving comments. The questions, of course, as luck would have it, are now coming thick and fast. Hilary has pointed out that Stuart Hood's memoir of Fontanellato, Pebbles from My Skull, was first published in this country in 1963, reprinted in 2013. Paula Bondani is telling us that she's leading a walk next summer in the Apennines based on Eric Newby's book, Love and War and in the Apennines. And I find, she says, more and more people fascinated by these stories during my walks. Isn't that lovely? And I'm going to finish here with David Lax, who says, my father's life was saved by brave contadini in Garula. That is a certainty, and he remained eternally grateful. Amen to that. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on this Bugle Call to Freedom Zoom. I'd like to add my personal congratulations and thanks to Marco, John, and the team for producing this absolutely wonderful book. I do hope you've enjoyed the Zoom and that you'll now be keen to buy Bugle Call to Freedom, your very own copy, available from all bookshops and on Amazon. Price £10. And thanks to the kindness of the author, the translator, and the producer, all proceeds are going to the trust. So, with Christmas approaching, ladies and gentlemen, please buy generously. There's no limit to the copies available, so we can sell thousands simply on the basis of this Zoom if we all put our minds together and work on it. Now, Namina, if you'd like to put everybody up on the screen, if that's possible.
I'll try. If you put all yourself in a gallery view, you will see all the participants on this call. It's on your top right.
On your top challenge.
Right. Yeah.
Put yourself on gallery view and see absolutely everybody who is taking part in this call. Let's all give each other a warm lockdown wave. Please keep safe. Good night and thank you for joining us. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci.